I didn't flinch when she said it, not because it didn't hurt, but because pain, when you're used to holding it in, folds neatly into silence. We were at my son's first birthday party. The backyard was strung with soft white lights, the kind that made everything look warm and gentle. People laughed, clinked glasses, passed around slices of cake. I was talking to my mother-in-law when she walked past my husband's sister, Laura. She didn't look at me. She just leaned in, smirking faintly, and let the words slip out like poison through silk. "He's cute. Looks nothing like your husband, though." And just like that, I knew. The rumors had started. Or worse, they had been simmering long enough for her to feel bold enough to say it to my face. I turned to look at her. Not sharply, not dramatically, just enough for her to see that I'd heard her. She smiled, gave a small shrug, and kept walking. I didn't say anything that day. Not to her, not to my husband, not even to myself. I just tucked the moment into the quiet place inside me next to all the other things I'd learned not to react to. But later that night, as I folded up leftover napkins and scraped frosting off plastic plates, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not just the words, but the certainty in her tone. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed up as a joke. And suddenly, a lot of things began to click. The coldness in my husband's voice lately. The way his family had started avoiding eye contact whenever my son was in the room. The strange pause at dinner last week when I said our son had his father's eyes and nobody responded. At first I told myself I was imagining it, that motherhood was making me paranoid, that maybe they were just distant, distracted. Not everything has to mean something. But Laura's whisper cracked the illusion. I should have been angry, furious even, but mostly I felt tired, not because I was broken, because I was awake. I met my husband, Daniel, 8 years ago. He was everything I wasn't supposed to have polished ambitious. Born into a family that had wealth buried in its name, like old moneyed secrets. His father ran a real estate firm that owned half the historic buildings in our part of Connecticut. His mother came from lawyers and senators. His sister Laura graduated from Yale, did charity galas, and never missed a chance to remind people of it. Me, I was an art school girl with a scholarship and a used car that died twice on the drive to our first date. But Daniel loved that. At least he said he did. He loved that I was different, grounded, real. He said I made him feel like he wasn't just a product of expectation. We got married 2 years later. I thought his family had accepted me begrudgingly, yes, but acceptance nonetheless. They smiled for the wedding photos. They offered polite hugs at holidays. They even threw me a baby shower when I got pregnant. But deep down, I knew the truth. They were waiting for me to prove them right. They thought I wanted money, status, an easier life. And if I gave them a reason, even the thinnest excuse, they would use it. Laura's whisper wasn't random. It was strategy. That night, I watched my son sleep, his chest rising and falling, small fists curled up near his face. He was so peaceful, so perfect. He had Daniel's mouth, my father's chin, big, thoughtful eyes that sometimes went solemn for no reason at all. I would never let anyone take him from me, not with gossip, not with lies, not with poison whispered behind birthday cake. But I also knew something else. Arguing wouldn't work. Defending myself would only make me look guilty. I needed more than outrage. I needed evidence, cold, undeniable, timed just right. So I made a decision. I wouldn't scream, I wouldn't plead, I would prove it once and for all. And when I did, I would not be kind. We met in the most unremarkable way at a charity event I wasn't even supposed to attend. A friend had an extra ticket, and I had nothing better to do on a rainy Thursday night in New Haven. I showed up in a second-hand blazer, damp hair, and zero expectations. Daniel, on the other hand, walked in like the room belonged to him. He was magnetic in that effortless kind of way. Not loud, not flashy, just certain. I didn't know who he was back then. I didn't recognize the name, the weight it carried. I just remember him noticing my sketches on a napkin and saying, "You draw like someone who listens more than they speak." That line stuck with me. So did he. We started talking, then meeting, then falling. It wasn't fast, but it was deep, like slipping into something you didn't realize you'd been waiting for. He told me he felt suffocated by his family, by their expectations, their Polish, the constant pressure to present perfection. He said I was real, raw, honest. He said I made him feel like himself. I believed him. Maybe he believed it too. Back then. The first time I met his family, I wore a dress that was probably too plain and smiled a little too hard. Laura sized me up in 5 seconds. She asked where I went to school, not out of curiosity, but calculation. I told her the truth, community college, then a transfer to an arts program at a state university. She smiled like I'd confirmed something she was hoping was true. His mother, Margaret, was harder to read, gracious in a cold museum sort of way. Every compliment from her sounded like a suggestion wrapped in lace. "You have such earthy taste," she said once, eyeing a necklace I'd made myself. "It's very expressive." His father was polite but distracted. He barely looked up from his phone. Later, I found out he was in the middle of brokering a deal that would net the family another 8-figure property. Everything else was background noise, including me. Still, Daniel defended me, or tried to. He told me not to worry, that they'd come around, that we didn't need their approval, and maybe that was true until the wedding. The closer we got to saying I do, the more pressure there was. Suddenly, his family wanted input on everything. The venue, the guest list, the prenup. That last one was the real turning point. They asked me to sign it 3 weeks before the wedding. Daniel looked ashamed when he handed it to me. "It's just something my dad insists on," he said. "It doesn't mean anything." But it did. It meant they still thought I was temporary. I signed it, without hesitation, not because I didn't care about the money, but because I wanted them to know I wasn't after it. I was after him. For a while, things were good. We got a tiny apartment in the city. I picked up freelance design work. He started taking on more roles in the family business. We cooked together, laughed, grew. The pressure from his family never fully disappeared, but it faded like background noise, behind a song we both liked too much to stop playing. Then I got pregnant, and everything changed. At first, there was excitement, a real shared joy. Daniel cried when we saw the heartbeat. He kissed my belly every night. He read books about fatherhood and nutrition. He held my hand during every appointment, but his family, they didn't react the same. His mother said all the right things, but with a stiff smile. "You're young," she said. "It's going to be an adjustment." Laura didn't even bother pretending. She just said, "Wow, that's fast." I'd been married to their son for 3 years, but somehow in their eyes, I was still a mistake. Now I was a pregnant mistake. And then came the questions, subtle at first, then sharper. When exactly did you find out you were expecting? Was it planned? Are you sure about the dates? I told myself they were just being cautious. But a voice inside me whispered something colder. They didn't believe the baby was Daniel's. I told Daniel about it once, about the way Laura looked at me, the things she said behind closed doors. He brushed it off. "She's just bitter," he said. "Ignore her." But I couldn't. Because I could see it in his eyes, too, something had shifted. He stopped asking how I was feeling. He worked later. He pulled away in small, quiet ways. I'd catch him staring at our son after he was born, with a look I couldn't read. Not anger, not joy, something in between. And then one day I found a crumpled envelope in his office drawer. It was from a DNA testing service, the kind you order online, the kind you don't tell your wife about. It wasn't opened, yet. I didn't confront him. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized in that moment that he didn't trust me anymore. And love without trust is like a match without oxygen. It might have sparked, but it was never going to burn. It wasn't public. Not at first. Laura didn't need an audience to wound you. She preferred smaller rooms ones where your shame could echo louder without interruption. It started as a dinner. Just the 4 of us, me, Daniel, his mother, Margaret, and Laura. Daniel said it was meant to clear the air. He told me he wanted things to feel normal again. What I didn't realize was that he wasn't hosting a dinner. He was bringing me to a courtroom I hadn't agreed to enter. The table was already set when we arrived too neatly. Candles, folded napkins, wine chilled to the exact temperature. It looked more like a formal presentation than a family meal. Laura greeted me with her signature smile, sharp, insincere, like a knife wrapped in velvet. Margaret barely looked up from her glass. I sat, I smiled, I played along for about 12 minutes. That's how long it took for Laura to say it. So, any plans to do a real DNA test yet? The room went still. Not silent, just tight, like the air itself was holding its breath. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at Daniel. He didn't look back. Laura leaned forward, elbows on the table, chin resting casually on one hand. Because you know there are ways to get it done discreetly these days. Saliva swabs, private labs. Totally legal, totally clarifying. I stayed quiet, not because I didn't have words, because I wanted them to keep talking. People always reveal more when they think you're defenseless. Margaret set down her wine glass, finally spoke. We're not accusing you, dear, but with everything at stake, surely you can understand the need for certainty. Everything at stake. That was the giveaway. This wasn't about love or trust. It was about money. You see, Daniel's father had been ill for years. He'd built a real estate empire, but after his second stroke, it was clear the transition of power and assets was coming. Soon. Margaret was terrified the bloodline might get diluted. Laura was terrified her share might. And Daniel, he was just afraid. Of them, of conflict, of me. He said nothing, not when Laura called my son suspicious. Not when Margaret suggested we just clear this up quietly for everyone's peace of mind. Not even when I finally stood up, tucked my napkin in slow motion, and said, "If you think you're talking to someone stupid, try again." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I looked each of them in the eye and walked out. Daniel didn't follow me. That night, I packed a small bag for me and my son. I left the house before dawn and drove to my mother's 2-bedroom apartment an hour away. I didn't call Daniel. He didn't call me. It took 3 days before the silence cracked. He emailed. Not called, emailed. I don't want this to become something ugly, but you disappearing with our child is not okay. My mother is talking to legal counsel. I suggest we handle this maturely. Maturely. That word from a man who let his sister dissect my life, like a scandalous headline, felt laughable. But I didn't respond in anger. I responded in strategy. The next morning, I booked an appointment with a genetic diagnostics firm. Not some mailing kit, not a pop-up clinic, a certified notarized court-admissible DNA test performed through my physician and processed by a lab that handled forensic cases. I didn't tell anyone. No grand announcement, no social media posts, no confrontational emails. Just action, a quiet preparation for the storm I knew would come. The results took 6 days. During those 6 days, Daniel's family called 3 times, all voicemails. Margaret tried guilt. This is affecting Daniel's health. Don't punish everyone for your pride. Laura tried sarcasm. Avoiding us doesn't make you innocent. Daniel said nothing at all. When the results came in, I drove to pick them up in person. I remember sitting in my car afterward holding the envelope. My son was asleep in the back seat, one tiny hand curled around his stuffed lion. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just opened it, scanned the numbers, saw the conclusion in bold print, probability of paternity 99.999%. That was it. Everything they'd whispered, everything they'd thrown at me shattered by 9 numbers and 1 decimal. But I didn't send them the results. Not yet. Because sometimes the truth is a knife, and if you're patient, you can let the liars build the stage, gather the crowd, and raise their voices just in time for you to cut them down in front of everyone. So I waited. Because justice isn't just about being right. It's about proving it publicly, irrevocably, and on your own terms. There's a moment right after you stop crying, but before you start fighting, where everything inside you goes still. Not calm, not peaceful, just precise. That's where I lived for weeks. Daniel didn't come to see us. Laura kept posting family brunches without us pictures, with captions like loyalty over blood and real family shows up. Margaret reached out once through a lawyer to request clarity for inheritance planning purposes. They weren't even pretending anymore. This wasn't about love. This was about control. But they'd underestimated me. They thought my silence meant weakness, that I had left in shame, that I'd cracked. But I hadn't. I was sharpening. I started preparing. Not emotionally, legally, strategically, quietly. I retained a lawyer, someone who didn't know my husband's family, someone ruthless but discreet. Together we filed documentation of the DNA results, notarized and time-stamped. We requested a statement of custody, drafted an affidavit of good standing, and laid the foundation for something bigger than just clearing my name. This wasn't just about proving paternity anymore. This was about positioning my son, my real rightful son, as heir. Because there was something none of them had accounted for. Daniel's father, Arthur, had seen the cracks too. He was older, quieter, more calculating than his wife and daughter. He never confronted me, never asked questions. But there were moments, tiny, unspoken ones, where I caught him watching me with a kind of distant curiosity. Not distrust, not fondness either, just assessment. Now I understood why. He was dying, and he wanted to know exactly what kind of woman might inherit part of his empire, or raise its future. I found out from an insider, someone in the firm who owed me a favor, that Arthur had recently updated his will. That alone wasn't surprising. But what he added that changed everything. A new clause, discreet but ironclad. In the event that my son Daniel has offspring of direct blood relation, said child will receive entitlement to 40% of my personal estate, on condition that biological legitimacy is proven by a certified medical institution, and that the child's custodial guardian is deemed legally and ethically fit. 40%. More than Daniel, more than Laura, more than Margaret. And the clause was airtight. The only person who could challenge it was Daniel himself, and even then, he would have to disprove paternity in court. Which, thanks to my test, he couldn't. I didn't leak this, I didn't run to the media, I didn't threaten anyone, I just waited. Because I knew they would make the next move, and when they did, it would be public. That's what people like them always do. They live for control. They think the courtroom is theirs. They think a woman like me can't afford to be patient. They forgot the most important rule: power doesn't scream. It whispers, then it signs, and then it owns. 2 weeks later, Arthur passed away in his sleep. No big drama, no final speeches, just a quiet end to a loud legacy. The funeral was as cold and curated as the family ever was white flowers. Expensive silence, no room for tears that didn't match their script. Daniel didn't speak to me. He looked like a statue at the service. Laura wore black like it was armor. Margaret clutched pearls and pretended the world still revolved around her. And I stood at the back, holding my son. People stared, some whispered. But no one said anything to me directly. They didn't need to. I wasn't there for them. I was there for what came next. 3 days later, the will was read. In the law firm's downtown office with panoramic windows and real wood bookshelves, they gathered like royalty awaiting a coronation. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be, because my lawyer was. He walked in 15 minutes after the reading began, briefcase in hand, and handed the executor a sealed envelope, certified DNA, custody documentation, a notarized affidavit confirming ethical standing. And then he sat back and watched as their faces collapsed in sequence. Laura first. She hissed something sharp under her breath. Margaret tried to argue clause language, but it was too late. Arthur had prepared this, anticipated them, protected the only bloodline that wasn't poisoned by entitlement. Daniel. He said nothing, because he couldn't, because he knew. And in that moment, silence finally shifted. Not from me, from them. The news hit like a detonation. 40%. Not just of Arthur's estate, of his personal holdings, his private shares, off-record trusts, and real assets not tied to the company. It was an empire within an empire. And my son now owned almost half of it. The room where they read the will must have been silent enough to hear every ego shatter. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to. Within hours, I received 3 separate phone calls. First came Margaret. Controlled, cold. This isn't what Arthur would have wanted. He was not in sound mind. I didn't let her finish. He was lucid enough to create a clause. And I was calm enough to respect it. Then Laura, this is fraud. You manipulated an old man into handing over our legacy to a toddler. I paused, then asked one question. Are you calling your nephew a thief or your brother a liar? She hung up. And finally, Daniel, can we talk no anger, no pride, just that pitiful middle ground where men retreat when they realize they've lost both the battle and the right to pretend they ever led it. We met at a neutral cafe days later. He looked thinner, grayer, or maybe just smaller. I didn't know he said eyes searching mine. I didn't know my father changed the will, or that he believed I raised a hand to stop him. You didn't need to know. You just needed to trust me. He swallowed hard. I made a mistake. No, I replied, voice even. You made a choice. Mistakes are accidents. Choices are intentional. He asked to see our son more often. I told him that would depend on whether he could speak about our child without flinching. He asked if we could heal things. I told him I'd already healed, just not with him. And then I left. No raised voice, no tearful goodbye. Just a woman who had finally learned that peace doesn't come from reconciliation. It comes from removal. The next few weeks were chaos, just not for me. Margaret tried to contest the will, filed a motion claiming undue influence, citing Arthur's age and recent medications. The court dismissed it almost immediately. The clause had been added 9 months before, his death reviewed by 2 independent attorneys, and backed by psychiatric confirmation of mental clarity. Laura threatened to leak stories to the press, scandalous headlines about family betrayal and illegitimate children. My lawyer sent her a cease and desist letter with attached paternity verification and defamation liabilities that would cost her every cent of her inheritance. She backed off within 48 hours. They weren't used to being beaten on paper. They were used to whispers, to intimidation, to winning by default. But I'd changed the rules, because I hadn't fought them in their arena. I'd built my own. By the time the estate was settled, my son had a secure trust, 2 properties in his name, and enough legal firepower to keep leeches off for a decade. I didn't take a dime for myself. That was never the point. I wasn't after wealth. I was after correction. They had tried to shame me, isolate me, discredit the very blood of the child they now had to smile at during public appearances, and I let them whisper, let them mock, let them plot, because silence isn't submission, it's calculation. At the final mediation hearing, Laura showed up in a blazer too tight and a voice too loud. She tried one last time. I just don't understand how someone like her gets to decide the future of this family. The mediator barely blinked before replying, because someone like her, prepared. Laura stormed out. Margaret didn't show up at all. Daniel sat quietly in the corner, signing papers that made permanent what his silence had already chosen months ago. I left without looking back. There was nothing there worth seeing anymore. Outside the courthouse, the sky was clean. My son was waiting in the car with my sister. He looked up at me with those big, serious eyes, the ones they once questioned. I smiled and kissed his forehead. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, I whispered. You already exist, and that's enough. He giggled, a sound so pure it cut through the months of poison. I got in the car, buckled my seatbelt, and drove away from the wreckage. They built the fire, they set the war they lost. Not as a survivor, as a strategist. People assume that after a victory like mine, you celebrate. But the truth, I didn't pop champagne. I didn't dance. I didn't even smile that wide. Because some wins aren't sweet. They're silent, still, a kind of quiet that tastes more like relief than triumph. The truth had come out, but it had burned every bridge with it. Margaret stopped acknowledging my son's existence altogether. She refused to speak his name at gatherings, skipped birthdays, and told friends she was stepping back from family obligations due to grief. Grief, not over her husband's death, over losing control. Laura moved to the city, started working for a different firm, one that didn't carry her father's name. Word was she'd tried to convince the board the inheritance clause had been falsified. They laughed her out of the meeting. Daniel resigned from the family business altogether. He told reporters it was for personal growth and a desire to pursue more meaningful work. But everyone in the inner circle knew better. You don't quit your birthright unless the seat at the table's already been pulled out from under you. He tried reaching out a few more times, not through lawyers anymore, just him. Quiet calls, occasional voicemails where he sounded less like a man and more like a shadow of one. I'm sorry, I didn't think they'd go that far. I miss you. I never blocked him, but I never replied. Because when someone lets others destroy your name, your dignity, and your child's identity, and says nothing, their apologies are just echoes. Empty, uninvited, too late. People often ask me why I didn't fight harder to make them accept us. My answer is always the same. I don't build bridges back to places that tried to bury me. Freedom came slowly, not in grand gestures, but in the simple, sacred acts of ordinary life. Morning pancakes, tiny sneakers lined up by the door, a scribbled drawing handed to me with a grin, stick figures labeled Mommy and Me in wobbly handwriting. I stopped living in defense. I started creating again art prints commissions, not to prove anything, just because I could. I opened a small studio 2 blocks from home. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. No one questioned my worth. No one asked whose name was on the lease. No one whispered. The only time I saw Laura again was 6 months later. It was accidental, a gala in the city. I was there with a client. She was across the room, frozen mid-laugh when she noticed me. She looked tired, not ruined, just worn, like someone who'd finally realized money can't buy correction. We didn't speak, she didn't approach, but her eyes lingered just a little too long. I didn't look away, and Daniel, he sent a birthday card for our son. Signed it Dad, as if the word alone could rebuild what he'd let rot. I didn't return it, didn't tell our son it had come. Maybe that sounds cruel, but children don't need half-hearted love from people who once doubted their very blood. They need peace, stability, certainty, and I had fought too hard to give him anything less. Some nights I still lie awake, not out of regret, but out of awe, at how quietly everything collapsed and how little noise I had to make to survive it. They tried to erase me, tried to turn suspicion into truth through repetition, tried to weaponize legacy and bloodlines and lies. But they forgot something fundamental. Truth doesn't need defending, it just needs time, and I had both. When I close the studio each day, I walk my son home. We pass playgrounds, cafes, rows of windows lit with dinner tables and homework battles, and lives that never made the headlines. He asks about colors, about birds, about clouds shaped like dinosaurs. He doesn't ask about his father, not yet, but one day he might. And when he does, I'll tell him he was part of the beginning, but we chose the ending. Rebuilding doesn't start with ambition, it starts with quiet, with mornings where you wake up, and the weight on your chest is just a blanket, not dread, not memory, not shame. That's where I began, not with a plan, not with vengeance, but with space, and silence, and breath. The settlement gave my son security, but what I built afterward gave me identity. I started small. A pop-up art booth at weekend markets, just me, some prints, and a square reader. No one cared who I was married to. No one asked about DNA tests or inheritance, or whispered about scandals behind paper cups. They saw color, form, skill. And slowly, customers became clients, clients became collectors, collectors became supporters. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I was creating value. The gallery came next. A renovated brick space 2 blocks off Main Street. Exposed beams, sunlight that poured in like forgiveness. I didn't name it after myself. I named it after my son. Something subtle, something real, something that told the world he is the beginning of everything I reclaimed. People like Laura couldn't understand that. They saw success as something loud, marketed, photographed. But I wasn't interested in being seen. I was interested in being untouchable. Clients asked me to speak on panels, to mentor, to teach. I said no to most of it. Not because I lacked confidence, because I had nothing left to prove. Let them underestimate me. Let them think I faded away after the scandal, that I took my payout and disappeared into some quiet, defeated suburb. It made my growth easier, invisible, secure, exactly how I wanted it. Daniel sent one final email nearly 2 years after our last conversation. I heard you opened a gallery. I always knew you'd do something beautiful. I hope our son gets to see the best of you. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because some chapters don't need a closing line. They just need to stop being reread. My son grew bright, curious, unapologetically himself. He asked hard questions, and I gave him honest answers. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, like giving someone a map instead of dragging them through the route. He knows who he is, he knows who I am, and more importantly, he knows who he never has to become. Sometimes I see people from the past. An old friend of Laura's browsing the gallery, a former neighbor who used to keep her distance, now asking for commissions. They always say the same thing, "You've really come a long way." As if I tripped into stability, as if this piece was a gift, not a war won in silence. I just nod. They don't need to know the weight of what I carried here. They couldn't hold it if they tried. There's a kind of satisfaction that doesn't need witnesses. No applause, no headlines, just knowing they once said I wasn't worthy, that I didn't belong, that my son was a mistake and I was a parasite. And now I'm the signature on contracts they can't access. I'm the owner of deeds they never saw coming. I'm the guardian of a legacy they failed to protect. And I did it without raising my voice once. Some people think silence is weakness, that women like me are dangerous only when we scream. They're wrong. The most dangerous women are the ones who learn to wait, who learn to sharpen their silence until it cuts cleaner than words, who walk away, not because they're afraid, but because they know they're worth more than what they're walking from. I became that woman, not overnight, not through revenge, but through clarity. And clarity doesn't roar, it signs leases, signs checks, signs freedom. Victory wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with confetti. There was no grand finale, no courtroom drama, no face-to-face confrontation where I got to say everything I once rehearsed in my head. Instead, it looked like this sunlight on my son's hair as he laughed on a swing. My gallery door clicking shut after a sold-out weekend. The first morning I woke up without checking for his name in the news. That's how I knew. I was free. People think peace is passive. But let me tell you something. Peace is the most active thing I've ever chosen. It meant letting go of the need to be heard by those who never listened. It meant not chasing apologies I could recite better than they ever could. It meant walking away from the version of myself that always braced for impact. And I don't miss her. I still get questions now and then, from new clients who Google too deeply, from distant relatives who meant well, from strangers who've read the headlines but missed the truth. Was it hard proving he was the father? No. What was hard was knowing the people I loved thought I wasn't enough to tell the truth. Don't you wish you'd fought louder? No. Because if I had raised my voice, they would have said I was emotional, unstable, dangerous. I let them speak. I let them dig the hole. And then I let the facts bury their stories. My son knows what happened. Not all the details, not yet, but enough. He knows that people once tried to pretend he didn't belong, and that I made sure he never doubted it for a second. He knows that the truth isn't always loud, that sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who just stands still and doesn't flinch. We have a new life now, different. Smaller in some ways, but richer in all the ones that count. There's a rhythm to our days. We cook, we read, we draw on the windows with washable markers. The noise is gone. All that remains is the hum of real life uninterrupted. Laura hasn't resurfaced. Margaret moved to Florida, quietly, as if proximity to son might bleach out the shame. Daniel remarried last year. His new wife posts inspirational quotes online and pretends none of us exist. That's fine. I'm not in their world anymore. And the truth is, I never really was. They tried to make me feel like I didn't belong, but the only thing I didn't belong to was them. Sometimes I look back, not with regret, not even with anger, just acknowledgement of what I survived, of who I became. Because they didn't break me, they revealed me. This story could have gone 1,000 different ways. If I'd yelled, if I'd begged, if I'd shrunk. But I didn't. I chose silent strategy and stillness. And in the end, they lost their legacy. I built one. So when people ask me what I learned from all of this, I don't say never trust anyone. I say don't fight to be believed. fight to be undeniable. Because truth isn't a weapon, it's a mirror. You don't swing it at your enemies, you just hold it up and let them destroy themselves with the reflection, he was mine, he always was. And now the world knows it. That's not revenge, that's justice, earned, lived, kept.